Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's webinar, an introduction to ISO 27017 and ISO 27018. I'm Tim Pennell, and I'm your host for the next 30 minutes. But before I get into the meat of the subject, a bit about NQA for those of you who've not previously attended one of our webinars. NQA is a world-leading certification body with global operations. We're number one for aerospace certification in the US, top three in the UK for 9,000, 14,000, 45,000 and 27,001, and we're number one in the Chinese automotive certification sector. We specialize in management systems certification for quality, aerospace and automotive quality, environmental and energy, health and safety, information resilience, which includes information security, privacy, and business continuity, and then food safety, risk management, and medical devices. We offer a range of training for all our specialisms, including virtual learning, webinars such as this, in-house training on your premises, restrictions permitting, of course, and we can provide training at various public nationwide locations. And a bit about me. I head up NQA's Information Assurance Business Unit, where I specialize in information security, privacy, and business continuity. And this is a result of a long career in security, compliance, and governance, and with a track record of running multiple information security management systems. So I have sat on the other side of the table from the auditor and know what it's like to be audited. If you have any questions, please type them into the chat box as soon as you think of them, and then I can hopefully answer them during the Q&A at the end. As ever, with all NQA webinars, you'll receive a recording of the webinar from our marketing team. Okay, ISO 27001 is a well-known and widely implemented standard. The controls in Annex A, as described in 27002, have been information security industry best practice for many years now. Indeed, they originated from the old mainframe days, but technology and regulation has inexorably moved on, and one of the frequent criticisms, if that's not too strong a word, is that it hasn't kept up, particularly with the rush to use cloud, whatever flavor of cloud that may be. I don't think it's a fair criticism, in that the majority of NQA's 27001 clients use cloud services, be it in-house or external, and by and large, 27,000 controls are perfectly adequate. Nonetheless, the ISO and the IEC have recognized the need for extensions to 27001 to cope with the nuanced security challenges that cloud services bring. So today's brief will be an overview of ISO 27017. But in the past few years, organizations have had no choice but to ensure that the privacy of the personal data they process is appropriately managed and protected. In recognition of this, 27018 was recently launched to extend 27001 to cover privacy in the cloud. But you may also be aware of ISO 27701, Privacy Management Extension to 27001, which is really growing in popularity. If an organization has implemented 27701, why should they bother with 27018? Well, I'll answer that question as well by comparing both standards. But before I do any of that, I'll start by reminding us of how the standards are extensions to 27002, in fact, and what that looks like in practice. And as always, we'll end with a Q&A. This webinar, then, is a soundbite canter through 27017 and 18, followed by a gallop through 27701. It should give you sufficient information about the standards to help decide whether or not to pursue them further. If you do, then I hope you'll choose NQA to be your certification partner. So let's begin by sucking some eggs. My apologies, but I'm sure that many of you are aware of the differences between the 27,000 family of standards. But it's worth a reminder because it underpins all of what I'll be discussing. First up, on the left, is the daddy, 27001, which is a management system standard. That is, it has all of the standard Annex SL management system clauses, from context of the organization to leadership, planning, support, operation, performance evaluation, and improvement. And because it's a management system, you can be certified to it. It also has something that no other management system has, which is the 114 security controls in Annex A, which are generally regarded as industry best practice for information security. Each of those controls are mandatory unless you can justify why they're not applicable. Over on the right, we have codes of practice. That is guidance on security controls. And 27002 specifically has guidance for all 114 Annex A controls in 27001. But because the standards on the right are for guidance, you can't be certified to them. Well, you can sort of, and we'll see later how we achieve that using 27001 as the foundation. Another way of looking at 27017 and 27018 is as extensions to 27001 if implemented. 27701, however, has a foot in both camps. It extends 27001's management system clauses, which are requirements to create a privacy information management system, and it adds more privacy controls as extensions to 27001 and 27002. And at the very end, I've got a summary slide listing all of the differences. But 27701 is subject to a webinar in its own right, which I've previously given and can be downloaded from NQA's website. So let's have a look at examples to highlight the differences and similarities. On the left, we have Annex A Control 8.2.2. Note the terminology. An appropriate set of procedures for information labeling shall be developed and implemented. Shall, in the language of ISO, is a requirement that it is necessary to follow, e.g. you have to do it. On the right, we have 27002's guidance for the same control. But note that it says an appropriate set of procedures for information labeling should be developed and implemented. And should makes all the difference in that it's a recommendation only. I, as an auditor, can't raise non-conformities against guidance, but it's a useful document for achieving a common understanding between auditor and client on an Annex A control intent. I also like the other information section, and I think this is where the 27000 series really wins its spurs. It states that labeled information makes it easier to identify and steal. So 27002 supports and encourages risk-based thinking. There are very few absolutes in information security. Here's the same control in 27017 for cloud service customers and for cloud service providers. Note how it starts with saying that the same control in 27002 applies and that this is in addition to 27002. It's not extending 27001. Then, as you'd expect for guidance, it uses the should terminology. Now for 27018, only this time I've not picked 8.2.2. Why? Well, because all 27018 has to say about 8.2.2 is that the guidance in 27002 applies. 27018 doesn't extend 8.2.2, and that's important to note that all three guidance standards only extend certain 27002 controls, not the whole lot. So in this case, I've picked 10.1.1, which again states the same control in 27002 applies, and then it's followed by some guidance. Now for 27701, and note how the numbering is different. It's saying that 8.2.2 from 27002 applies, but it's actually control 6.5.2.2, and that's down to the way 27701 is constructed, with additional Annex SL controls, extensions to 27002, and clauses with guidance for PII controllers and processes. So if you're grappling with the numbering scheme in 27701, only the last two digits are common, and we'll have another look at this later on. If you haven't managed to keep up, don't worry, I have to keep reminding myself of the differences. So in order to provide some more detail, let's have a look at each standard. Pictorially then, 27,017 can be described as a bolt-on to 27,001. How? When it only extends the controls in 27,002. Well, first of all, for cloud services customers, it provides additional guidance for 33 of the 27,002 controls and 31 if you're a cloud service provider. And then it provides 5 new controls for customers and 7 new controls for providers. What I don't show on this graphic is that the extensions to 27,002 are in the main body of the document and the new controls are in Annex A. So yes, 27,001 has an Annex A with controls, but the guidance is in 27,002, whereas 27,017 has new controls in an Annex A along with their associated guidance. Stick with me, folks. So you must already have an ISO 27001 certification in place. In order to extend your management system to include 27,017, you'll add the new controls to your statement of applicability, depending on whether you're a customer or a provider. You could be both. If you'd selected all 114 controls from 27,001, then you could be looking at 121 controls in total. And then when I audit you, I'll take into account the guidance in 27,017, essentially changing 27,017's shoulds into shalls because you want me to, otherwise how can I assess you for conformity? And should you pass muster, then your 27,001 certificate would have additional text saying as extended by 27,017. This slide shows the distribution of the extended and new controls. You can see that all of the heavy lifting takes place in section 9, access control, and section 12, operation security, which makes sense given the context. As a reminder, I discussed in the previous slide that I'd ordered the extended definitions, but it's important to note that you'll have performed a risk assessment beforehand and your risk treatment is the selection of those controls. So you must make it clear in the SOA, when I audit you, which controls you've selected for extension and which you have not. Here are the new controls from 27,017's Annex A. There's nothing groundbreaking in them. And again, based on your risk assessment, you need to decide which ones to include in your SOA. So let's have a look at a couple of them. Cloud or CLD 8.1. The first thing to note is that although it's a new control, it slots into section 8 of 27,002, so it inherits the objective of clause 8.1. Clause 8.1 has controls 8.1.1 to 8.1.4, so this is just a new one to add to the end of that list, but your numbering would read A.8.1 to A.8.1.4 and then CLD.8.1.5. And I'm sure you agree it's a common sense control, although I should imagine that providers won't return assets, they probably expect their customer to remove them. I wanted to show Cloud or CLD 12.1.5 simply because of the highlighted guidance for providers. I don't know of any cloud service provider who would provide to customers documentation about their critical operations and procedures, perhaps business continuity measures, or as described in the other information section, incident management, but I wouldn't like to reveal too much of my internal operations to third parties. Well, the benefits, in common with certification to all such standards, it's about obtaining and demonstrating assurance, whether it be an external or internal need. From an internal requirement, it's a very important part of governance, risk and compliance. In particular, when stuff is outsourced, it provides assurance over controls that the organization isn't operating themselves. Therefore, it's a very good way for providers to provide that assurance to their customers. And it also helps the need for providers to suffer multiple client audits. On almost every webinar I give, I make the point of holding suppliers to account. It's hard to do if you lack the information security experience in-house, but if you make it a prerequisite for tendering, a certified cloud supplier provider will have a competitive advantage and make your life easier in choosing them. And now for the same but different. cloud privacy. Cloud providers who are acting as processors have 16 extended 27002 controls for security, 13 new security controls, and 12 new privacy controls. Again, in the statement of applicability, indicate which 27001 controls have been selected for extension and include any extra new controls you deem required. Note, and this is the same for 27017, where you're adding in new controls, you still have to justify why you're excluding any of the controls. That is, list them all in the SOA and justify inclusions and exclusions. Note that the standard is for a public cloud service provider who is acting as a processor. It's not for a processor that is using public cloud services. This also means that it's not intended for private cloud users, although the standard does say that controllers could use it as a guidance. And to be sure, let's remind ourselves of the definitions. These are lifted from GDPR, but the ISO definition is to all intents and purposes the same. A controller determines the means and purposes of processing personal data, whereas a processor processes personal data on behalf of the controller. Actually, it can be argued that the cloud service provider has determined the means of the processing, which is why the controller has engaged them, but to all intents and purposes, that's moot. The standard has, in the foreword, a lot to say about control selection. It knows 5 reasons why you might select controls, as shown here. Points 1 to 4 are fairly standard. Point 5, I think, is unique, and so the diagram shows the standard cloud computing architecture, which I'm sure you're familiar with. But to be frank, I struggle to think of any of 27018's controls that wouldn't be applicable in any of the layers. But it's nice of ISO to give us the option. Here's the distribution of the enhanced controls. And again, most of them are in access control and operations security, with some examples to the right. Note that these are enhancing security controls to take into account the importance of PII and how it might arise in regular security activities. Remember that I said 27018 has new security controls. These are in section 11 of Annex A in 27018. The other section in Annex A cover new privacy controls, which we'll see in a minute. But here are the new security controls. Again, nothing groundbreaking, but still making the point of taking extra care with PII during normal security operations, as you can see there in the 2 examples. And here are the privacy controls. Note that the top level controls are aligned to ISO 29100, Security Techniques Privacy Framework. So 27018 doesn't have anything to say about collection limitation in A.4 and accuracy and quality in A.7. If you're already familiar with privacy legislation, then you'll see that these are simply controls that help enforce data subjects' rights. Similarly, it has nothing to say about individual participation and access in A9, but it supports accountability, the accountability principle and data transfers. But if in doubt, involve your DPO in the implementation of 27018. And the benefits, well, as with all standards, implementing 27018 provides assurance. In fact, the ICO has stated that it will look favorably on organizations that have suffered a breach but are certified to an appropriate standard. And on that note, if an organization is looking for a lighter weight alternative to 27701, then 27018 could be the way to go. So having said that, it could be an alternative. Let's have a quick look. Let's talk through the table. Clause 5 of 27701 extends clauses 4 and 6 in 27001, and there are 6 extensions in total. Clause 6 of 27701 provides additional guidance to 37 of 27002's controls guidance. Clause 7 of 27701 provides guidance for its own Annex A, not 27001's Annex A. And 27701 has an Annex B, so Clause 8 provides guidance to the controls in Annex B. Annex A has 31 controls for controllers, which are to be considered in addition to the 114 controls in 27001's Annex A. Annex B has 18 controls for processors, which are to be considered in addition to the 114 controls in 27001's Annex A. Now, I don't mind admitting I frequently get myself into knots over this. The point being that I'd audit Clause 5, Clause 6, and take into account the guidance in Clauses 7 and 8 when auditing the controls in Annexes A and B. Annex C shows the mapping to 29,100, but very usefully, it also has a GDPR mapping, which takes me to the sales page. Why implement 27701? Well, it's the only general privacy certification out there. And the French Data Protection Supervisor, the CNIL, had this to say about it. The standard was drafted at an international level with contributions from experts from all continents and the participation of several data protection authorities. Experts from the CNIL actively contributed to this standard with the support of the European Data Protection Board. It represents the state of the art in terms of privacy protection and will allow organizations adopting it to increase their maturity and demonstrate an active approach to data protection. I can't think of a better recommendation. And then finally, there's a mapping to 27018 and to 29151, the Code of Practice for Protecting PII. And here is the 27018 mapping. You can see here that if you've already implemented 27701, then 27018 is a minimal next step. There are 6 extra controls on this slide and 3 extra controls on this slide. So, having blown your mind with the confusing structuring and numbering, here's a summary. Taking all the standards into account, if you were to implement them, then 8 of 27001's Annex A controls are extended 4 times, and you'd have 72 additional controls for your statement of applicability. And in fact, I have a client who is going through this right now. Now, I'm not going to talk through this slide and the next. They're there as an aide-memoire for when you get a copy of the webinar and need a quick reminder of all of the structuring and numbering. I've color-coded the Annex A's as well to help make it easy to understand. I still refer to them just to remind me. So today I had a look at how 27002 was extended by controls in the standards and how the additional controls appear in the statement of applicability. We looked at 27017 cloud services security, 27018 protection of PII in public clouds for providers acting as processors, and then a quick look at 27701 privacy information management and its role in the jigsaw puzzle. I hope you enjoyed it and it was useful. It's time for some Q&A now. And we have some questions online. I will start to go through them. First one is from Grant. How will the proposed 27002 DIS affect the 2 standards, indeed the other 27,000 family standards? Grant, that's a really good question because, and I get asked this pretty much on every webinar I give. The changes to 27002, which, and I haven't seen them yet, but I understand that they include some element of cloud security and also a changing in the numbering. Yeah, we're not sure yet how that's going to affect 27001. So we're keeping a very close watching eye on that, and as soon as we have more information, we'll probably follow that up in a webinar just to distill our understanding and explain how that's going to affect certification and the migration to the new standards. And as and when it happens. In particular, what the uplift to 27,001 as and when that happens. So yeah, keep an eye on LinkedIn as well. We'll be posting on there. Then I've got a question from Deck Talk Consulting. It's too much for half an hour presentation. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It was, I said at the beginning, a quick canter through. To go through it in detail would probably take much more than an hour presentation. And the key, as you suggested there, is to break it up into individual sessions as and when we to have the detail. Please go back to the webinar and the slides, and hopefully it will be clear from there. As I said, the numbering is confusing. I still have to go back to the numbering myself and remind myself of where it all slots in. But yeah, point taken. You're absolutely right. And Karen, yeah, my pleasure. Glad you enjoyed it. Okay. If there's no more questions, then I will draw the webinar to a close. Everybody, thanks very much for this. As a reminder, you will be getting a copy of the recording and the slides, and hopefully we'll look forward to speaking to you in due course. I am, of course, on LinkedIn as well. Please connect with me, and if you've got any more questions, please get in touch. Thanks very much.